Hello and welcome. This talk is adapted from an hour-long one I've given regulated studios and at conferences. It was edited down to 20 minutes for Full Indie last year, and then back up to 35 minutes-ish for A11Y TO. It's been edited and updated about as many times as I've given it. It's really been through some things over the years. And since I recently went full-time at Ubisoft, this talk is probably largely getting retired. I thought this year I'd record it and set it free into the world via Can I Play That. I've grown fond of this talk. It's my baby. Still, this will be a little bit story time, games accessibility overview, and pep talk. I might cover some of what you already know, but it should be useful to everyone, no matter your discipline or experience. So I'm accessibility manager at Ubisoft. Before that, I was a freelance specialist and designer. I specialize in UX and systems design. In theory, UX is anything the user touches. In practice, it's often used as shorthand for UI designer, but I do mean the former. Systems and gameplay design is particularly interesting because it impacts the entire spectrum of accessibility. It requires a really creative and inclusive approach that can just make our games better experiences. Before Ubisoft, I've worked with both indies and AAA, including Bungie on Destiny 2, Media Molecule on Dreams, Crystal Dynamics on Marvel's Avengers, Guerrilla Games on Secrets, and more. I'm also a board member for GamerX, a non-profit supporting LGBTQ2IA+ games workers and fans, and an ambassador for Take This, a non-profit actively supporting mental health of both workers and fans across geekdom. I recently ran a crisis webinar for them in conjunction with the IGDA. My disabilities are a lovely excuse to break the rules, and I script my talks, as I'm autistic and a brain injury survivor. Besides, if it's good enough for politicians? It's my job to be well connected to the disability community, but we're not a monolith. I use language that my peers and I prefer, and the things I have to say may not apply to everyone. From a design perspective, it's vital to understand that disability is a broad spectrum, not a binary. Where I mention bias, it's not a personal failing. It's a comment on society and the things we work against together. Surprise! Like pretty much every person in the industry, I love games. They got me through big, scary things. Rainbow Islands, Captain Planet, and Carve Up were the first time I experienced escape from an abusive childhood. Pokemon Red got me through high school while also being homeless. Gaming was always there for me, even during my hectic 12-year career in art and film. At 31, I had a stroke. Unexpectedly, overnight, games were impossible. The room violently spun. I couldn't process tutorials, had memory gaps, excruciating pain, muscle spasms. It was crushing. I've lived with disabilities my entire life. They were largely undiagnosed, slowly progressive, and I was very good at hiding them. Until I wasn't. It's a long story on how I got from there to here. I blamed myself a lot. I lost so much, including my career. I've been doing this work for just over 4 years, but origin stories always go way back, and my path into games accessibility has actually been 10 years in the making. There's a thread somewhere on Twitter with details. The disability community taught me an incredible wealth about our culture and myself. I could finally make sense of my experiences and the world. I was given the incredible gift of strength to be proud of who I am. I worked hard to claw back some of what I lost and discovered my skills were transferable to game design and production. I started out as a subject matter expert, and through that saw a niche for tackling accessibility as a designer with first-hand experience. I threw myself in. I learned as much as I could about game design, accessibility, and the community. I still have so much to learn because we never stop. I watched all the archive talks about games accessibility I could find, some several times. I deeply watched the games accessibility guidelines, reviews, and learned from friends, peers, and strangers about their experiences and needs. Once I felt I had a grasp on accessibility, I naturally branched out to game design. I started with talks following designers I look up to on Twitter. They're all so willing to share their experience and expertise. Eventually, I moved into books and articles. All of it has been grounded in my knowledge and understanding of design from my previous career and the wider practice of universal design in other fields. I also want to recognize the foundations of those that came before people like me too. I wouldn't be here without them. There's an incredible movement for accessibility as old as games themselves. People who were labeled troublemakers, aggressors, and more. They carved the way in so people like me could have a place. I've learned so much from everyone, and several directly lifted me up, gave me a voice, encouraged me, and worked to get me here and continued to mentor me. I'm eternally grateful. I can't underestimate how much learning I've done on the job. Progressing from subject matter expert to specialist came at me fast. A lot of my technical game design knowledge came from those I've worked with. I've been encouraged heavily and made to feel I can do this everywhere I work. In the end, video games saved my life. This reemergence showed me we have the tools to grant the incredible gift of gaming to more people. I attribute my strength as a disabled person to understanding, finally, that the act of inclusion isn't on the individual to overcome as society tells us. It's not us that's the problem, it's the games. Accessibility is often framed as a fundamental need to avoid exclusion from basic necessities of life. But culturally, we need a dramatic reassessment of what the heck a basic necessity is. Disabled people are stigmatized, excluded, segregated, and made to feel different at every turn of life. I hear daily from disabled players and advocates. They give so freely of their time, experience, and yes, frustration and pain. There's no words to describe what exclusion from a massive cultural phenomenon like games does to already vulnerable and isolated people. Games move people in phenomenal ways, give us experiences we'd never have. They're more than entertainment. They empower us to build community and grasp the quality of life we deserve. For many, gaming is even pain management and therapy. I defy anyone to tell me culture, pain management, play, and human connection aren't basic necessities. When we can all play the same games, they unite us despite how different we are. We could talk stats, such as 25% of the world identifying as disabled, but that overlooks complexities of social stigma, intersectionality, and identity. Most disability is somewhat invisible, whether mobility, visual, hearing, fatigue, or even cognitive as with ADHD. When we look at access barriers rather than identity, we find much higher numbers of our audience impacted. Most importantly, when it comes to design, disability is a mismatch between us and the environment. Having wheels isn't disabling in themselves, they're actually freeing and fun for me. Steps, and more importantly, broken streets, just aren't made for cyborgs. It feels overwhelming, but it isn't about accounting for every disability or fixing people. Inclusive design is about designing for normal human variation, because disability is normal human variation. Having empathy for our players informs good design, but it's more than that. I also get stories from fellow developers, many with their own disabilities, and all working hard to be inclusive. It's okay to be overwhelmed. Game dev is overwhelming. I see how hard you're working, how much you care. Nothing is easy. You are seen and appreciated. Accessibility seems monumental, but it doesn't have to be. There's considerations in every stage of design, and we really can't ignore that. But first, in-game settings dramatically empower players and are an important early step. It's not about changing the core experience, it's about aligning the experiences of vastly different players so they can enjoy similar challenge and adventures regardless of hard limits. Designing games is about creating barriers, so accessibility is simply widening our ideas of who our players are, what challenge even is, and examining which barriers are unnecessary. Prescribing solutions isn't how we innovate, but examples give us a place to start. I loved the N64 controller. Lots of people passionately disagree with me, but that's okay. This is an accessibility principle. On the surface, it seems like preference, but digging deeper, we discover access barriers like muscle memory or injuries. This stick thing was new, and not only did players need to be taught how to use it, it was a mystery to the developers how any player would even be able to use it. So, in GoldenEye, we had 8 controller presets. Button remaps are a pressing issue that remains elusive. It's important for using assistive tech or less common controllers, but a simple example is needing to swap the shoulder and trigger buttons due to muscle weakness or pain. Many PC games have keyboard and mouse remapping, but it's often left out of controller support despite player needs being no different. System-level remaps on console or in Steam are not really solutions. They're intended as a band-aid, and a lot of players get so frustrated they don't use them. It breaks UI navigation, different modes, and in-game prompts. Additionally, Steam's remapping has a truly dense cognitive load that's actually overkill for most games. Taking it further, offering simplified controls enables players with more profound disabilities. Some approaches include automated actions like sprinting, making actions contextual, or offering multiple action types per button. Falcon Age did amazing work here, as did Ghost Recon Breakpoint. Other barriers and controls are unnecessary or long holds and mashing, mitigated by toggles or alternatives. As with GoldenEye, a variety of presets avoids cognitive barriers. One of my favorite things to hack away at is redesigning control and combat systems, so I really could get stuck on this topic for hours, which is one of the reasons I'm scripted. Okay, you know what? Giving talks remotely is really weird. Just saying. Okay, now I got that out of my system. Inclusive design requires a shift in how we see everything. Like so much design work, it comes with experience and knowledge. This is why I advise working with specialists in addition to disabled players in testing. I'll get to how we can achieve that in all spaces regardless of budget. Wave the Pacifist had an accessibility consultant as a key part of their team from the beginning. He's a fantastic one-handed speedrunner under the handle Half Coordinated. The game was really something. They also continued to patch after release. Their approach to difficulty was great. I have very strong opinions on this subject. Surprise. But difficulty is relative, and get good is toxic. I wrote a much less spicy IGN article on this, and every single option in a game affects our perception of difficulty. As you know, difficulty modes are just containers we stick a bunch of hidden parameters in. Pacifist opened this up, empowering players to keep the game challenging. They also did some lovely creative naming systems beyond easy or normal, because what is even normal anyway? In the end, difficulty modes are a starting point or a catch-all, but there's so many other ways to innovate we shouldn't fall back on them. A danger is leaving players feeling infantilized and bored. Of course, I have to give a shout out to Celeste and their assist mode as another example of flexible design principles. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was a leader too. In Pacifist, options for background contrast and HUD enlargement were implemented for low vision, but were a fantastic touch for cognitive accessibility. And in the end, everything affects our perception of difficulty. Accessibility intended for one group of players actually hits the needs of others too. Cognitive accessibility overlaps with all other needs, but especially hearing and vision. Subtitles are a well-known necessity for deaf players, but they're also crucial for autistic players with sensory or language processing disorders and other cognitive disabilities like ADHD. There can be a disconnect from senses and cognitive processing that essentially creates cognitive deafness, blindness, and coordination difficulties. Ubisoft has great telemetry, which shows over 60% of players turn subtitles and subtitle backgrounds on. Even more impressively, when they're on by default, less than 3 to 5% turn them off. Subtitles need to be designed well. For some deaf people, sign language is actually their first language and very different to spoken language. Of course, they can also have cognitive and learning disabilities. It isn't easy because you often have to reinvent the wheel, and there's little provided on the engine front. There's a couple of good plugins for Unity and Unreal, like Yellow Subs Machine, and studios often have their own tools, but we have to be careful of mistakes. Karen Stevens, Deaf Gamers TV, and Ian Hamilton all have talks online. A summary: large, sans serif fonts with consistent kerning, good contrast, no animation, and speaker names. The extra mile is closed captions for voiceover inflection and environmental audio cues. This can be the difference between someone getting frustrated and disliking your game to actually having a similar experience as hearing and neurotypical players. Think of all the beauty and what we put into environmental storytelling with audio design, the emotion and impact of voice acting, the jump scares of stingers, or the tension building of music. Why would we leave that out for some players? Sound is incredibly important for blind players. Several great advocates on this front are listed on this slide. Sightless Combat, Steve Saylor, Super Blind Man, BGFH79, and Meglish. The other side to sensory processing disorders is it overwhelms and causes pain and impacts cognition further. It's a vicious cycle that if we stress it leads to emotional and physical meltdowns. Options to finely control audio channels helps avoid sensory overload and improves access for blind players. It's important to remain balanced without too many spikes in range. No in-game options regardless of hardware are a hard barrier. Audio is a great example of affecting the perception of difficulty beyond expected systems. Turning down intense music or sound effects enables me to play seriously challenging games for longer and beat ultra-hard bosses impressively quickly. I just realized after years of giving this talk, I use the word impressive about myself. Oh dear. Next up, motion sickness is a surprisingly common one. Kona was an eerie game set in remote Canada that has a head bob toggle and camera sensitivity. Head bob creates immersion for some, but for others it's very unnatural movement that causes immense sickness. Many wouldn't think a console version of what is basically a walking sim would need sensitivity, but it can be crucial for motor disabilities and motion sickness. Additional settings that help with motion sickness are weapon bob, field of view, camera speed, motion blur, chromatic aberration, lighting bloom, yes, even on console, and camera movements. Oh, screen shake, my personal nemesis. It's increasingly popular in all genres, but causes illness and migraines as well as visual disturbances with low vision. It's an effect I think should be akin to a seasoning rather than a sauce a game is drowned in. That's obviously subjective, but what if it causes your audience physical pain that lasts beyond the time they spend playing? Swords of Ditto was fine at first, and I had a jolly old time with this lovely mashup of roguelike and top-down. Then came Big Stompy Boys, the technical term, and with every footstep it felt like my brain would explode right out of my eyes. Then there were 2, 4, 6 on screen at once. I was super sick for days with a migraine. Hearing my ordeal, bids updated to include a 0 to 10 screen shake slider. Finally, I could exact my revenge on those Stompy Boys. We're just starting to see screen shake options pop up. Even for people who don't have migraines or motion sickness, camera issues lead to fatigue and impaired cognitive function at a level where the player may not even know. A slider is always preferential to on-off because it can be degrees of effect. Oh. Technical difficulties at home are just as awkward as in person. Edging closer to my holy grail, reading comprehension impacts every disabled and non-disabled player. Lean in, I have something difficult to hear. In both indie and AAA, we are not very good at text-based design, even though we rely on it. Games are physically and mentally taxing. We ask a lot of players, and the more we ask, the less bandwidth they have. Even fatiguing players physically affects their cognition. Disabled players have less tolerance for physical and cognitive load due to fatigue and steeper entry points. Dyslexia alone affects 14% of people. If you add low vision, ADHD, brain injury, chronic fatigue and pain, autistic or deaf players, ESL, or even just people who are tired, like all of us, it's a lot. Hot tips for text accessibility. Bigger than you think. Don't leave too much wasted space. Sans serif font. Good weight and contrast. Minimal use of italics. Regular, well-spaced kerning. No movement, especially typewriter style or bouncing letters. As few animated distractions on screen as possible when reading is required. Pausing action. User-dismissed pop-ups. Text should never disappear on its own. If typewriter style bouncing serif, cursive, or italic fonts are important for your aesthetic, allow users to change them. Or get creative, for example Nintendo style, where pressing the action button skips text animation. It's important to note my advice is aimed at the fact that our text is often pretty small. The bigger and less dense you make your text, the more stylization you can get away with. Gone Home and Tacoma did well, although it was a tad small. More recently, Untitled Goose Game did great. Getting press again are so-called dyslexia-friendly fonts. They're a band-aid, much like OS-level remapping, not a solution. They only really work for a small number of people, for others they exacerbate the issue. It's lovely to think that there's a quick fix, but the science is misreported, and they're rooted in trying to fix the user rather than evaluating our design mistakes. We get frustrated when players skip our words or don't read properly, but instead of assuming people are lazy, we should be asking why more often. Destroy the social construct of laziness. That's accessibility in a nutshell. Ask why, and if you need to break guidelines, go for it and allow users more control. Grails. I think everybody in accessibility has one. For me, it's cognitive accessibility and the intersections with all other disabilities, fatigue, and chronic pain. It's often overlooked, misunderstood, and heavily stigmatized. Lately, I had the privilege to relay player stories through research and interviews. Right now, I'm digging back into my roots and getting uncomfortably personal. Sharing my personal story sometimes clouds people's ability to grasp my technical skills. But stories are power, and it's how I got here. In my late 20s, I was diagnosed with ADHD and learning disabilities. 6 years later, I discovered I was autistic. I was ashamed and afraid. I masked heavily my entire life. I was directly discriminated against the one time I tried to discuss ADHD with an employer. I came out about my cognitive disabilities shortly after my first stroke. It wasn't grand. I just started talking about it. The strokes I've had mostly impact my cognitive and vestibular functions. People assume that's why I have motor disabilities and use a wheelchair, but it's not. I use the phrase coming out very deliberately. I'm also queer, and being open about my cognitive disabilities is much harder. We talk about the impact of cognitive barriers in a very abstract way, using words like meltdown without talking about what that actually is. Games give me meltdowns. That's a weird thing to say. I adore games. I live, breathe, and work them. They still cause meltdowns. A meltdown happens to me in several ways. Autistic burnout, sensory information or emotional overload, processing everything is a challenge. It's actually a wonder I love games as much as I do, really. Games demand so much, and when you have limited capacity, it fast becomes overwhelming. My executive function misfires. I can't make decisions, prioritize tasks. I can't think. I'm suddenly exhausted, yawning. I struggle to read or see visual cues. All sounds blend together. Just painful noise. I can't process language. Controlling my hands gets harder. Remembering buttons or anything is impossible. Suddenly everything explodes and I'm crying. My skin is on fire, crawling with tiny flames. My hair and clothes are too heavy, too present. My brain feels itchy. I can never explain that one. If I need to be verbal, it escalates faster. This is as far as it gets with a game. I usually remove myself. In life, sometimes they escalate more and lead to physical response. I've screamed and torn my larynx. Once I almost tore a feeding tube from my stomach. It spirals and I lose control. It's awful, humiliating, and afterward I'm ridden with exhaustion and guilt. Even if I can put off a meltdown, it goes into a bank and I'm more likely to end up there as a result of being out in the world. Nothing happens in isolation. As designers, when we create access barriers, it's an impact. I get vulnerable because I need people to see that accessibility isn't about can or can't. Stories are power. It grounds my practice and keeps me mindful. Again, we approach from the lens that we're not here to fix the person. We want to address the harm we cause or simply where our designs aren't successful. All disabled people are impacted by the intersection of cognitive barriers, whether it's due to fatigue, pain, or often exacerbated by other types of barriers. Even non-disabled people experience it to a mild degree. It's most often chalked up to preference, frustration, or dislike. Many of the players most severely impacted, especially with specific cognitive disabilities, don't talk about it due to stigma. I see a lot of people blaming themselves. They're also massively underdiagnosed, especially among people marginalized by race, religion, gender, or background. There's a lot of developers under this umbrella, but too many have told me how they don't feel safe. Some of the most celebrated releases for accessibility have had significant cognitive barriers. That's okay. No game ships how we truly want it to, and it's still early days. But let's see if I can briefly sum it up. Cognitive access is best addressed by core design practices rather than settings. It's tied to cognitive load, which many of us know a thing or two about, but some players have less tolerance for that load. It involves executive dysfunction, attention, problem solving, reading comprehension, and memory. Then there's decision fatigue, which leaves players unable to make any decisions at all. All genres are impacted, but open world games are particularly difficult. If the world expands too quickly, players are landed with too many repetitive and seemingly inconsequential tasks, the map is too cluttered or hard to navigate, text is difficult to read, information overload with features like skill tree UI, pacing, timing, or language issues in tutorials, too many distractions in the UI, HUD, and so much more. It comes down to design choices, but being aware of potential problems, attention can be paid to navigation guidance, balanced pacing, rewarding and non-punishing exploration, comprehensive, optional and repeatable tutorials, practice areas, and clear, brief, consistent language. With UI, it's good flow, formatting, user-dismissed text pop-ups, non-animated text, sorting features, getting rid of distracting notification markers with options like mark all as read. In terms of addressing decision fatigue, it's important to not force constant, fast-paced and intensive memory tasks or decision-making by allowing users to compare upgrades or armor, not inundating the player with too many decisions too fast or too early in a game, and providing AI-assisted upgrade and modification options. Including legends, catalogs, and documentation is vital too. Player auto-logs could be a really innovative solution. We allow players to pace themselves and try to avoid overload. Minimizing distractions or how players learn can be quite individual. So this is where settings can help. In-game HUD customization, turning off NPC chatter, ignore, hide, or eject quests, minimizing animations, light, or sound. Options for adjusting the number of tutorials or hints. Shadow of the Tomb Raider did great. In Far Cry New Dawn, I even used the colorblind setting, because first of all, the colors were gorgeous, and secondly, I was able to process being hurt by enemies. It was suddenly visible to me. It was a vivid pink instead of dark red, and I often don't see the subtle dark red or tunnel vision. As with subtitles and audio, cognitive disability can manifest in ways where the brain just plain won't tell us that our eyes, ears, or hands have sensed something. It's impossible to just prescribe solutions because all games are so unique. We'll only really get good, innovative solutions when we're creative. So what works in my practice? I try to guide colleagues through problem solving. I bring in as much knowledge from across the industry as I can, what's worked recently in other games, what hasn't, what's been a good starting point and needs to go further. I relay community experiences and feedback. Checklists and guidelines can be a really good way to ground our practice and find starting points, but we really push the games industry forward when we move beyond them. So, collaborative design is the key component to my work. My favorite thing is hacking away at designs and working together to find ways to address barriers that still work within the core goals of the project. Again, games are about creating barriers. That's what makes a game. So we need to address the accidental barriers and be deliberate in our choices as designers. The industry is fractured by discipline. Sometimes we have to design solutions around or over other teams. It's the nature of the beast. What do you do when you're working with a systems team to address a barrier in the combat, but the combat designers want nothing to do with accessibility efforts? We design a system that works with the combat to break those barriers in other creative ways. Project management is an important step too, balancing impact versus priority, leading to roadmaps grounded in an understanding of possibilities for scope. This is a step that project testing and QA managers should be most focused on, understanding the needs of the community and the difference between statistics, telemetry, and the momentous impact on smaller numbers of players. I try to encourage developers of all disciplines to become connected to the experiences of their players and the impact of their designs. I really want everyone to grasp the basics, somehow, because it makes us better developers. Settings are a brilliant jumping off point, but there's a lot to be said for establishing usability in core design. If we can do it without bloating menus, we should. Managing cognitive and physical load, precision, timing, audio, animation, lighting, world design, progression systems, onboarding, UI, and how we design interaction for everything. Diversifying user testing, actively recruiting disabled players, learning to spot undisclosed disability or access barriers for what they are. Someone experiencing cognitive or sensory overload may have an extreme or unexpected emotional reaction. Someone with undisclosed motor disabilities may just tell you they hate the controls. Don't lose hope. There's so many creative possibilities for usability, from documentation, cute in-game guidance like in Nier Automata, creative game modes, practice modes, character classes or traits, to robust UI. I believe in your capacity for innovation and inclusion. I want games accessibility to bridge the gap and not be so isolated from the wider tech community. There's so much to learn from each other. I want us to have specialists across the industry, just like in tech. I want there to be so many of us it's a recognized role. I want us to fight the competitive urges capitalism instills in us and lift each other up, mentor each other, and show the world we have space and we deserve it. I want publishers, large studios, small studios, and tiny independents to understand that they can test across the spectrum of humanity, including disability. Even if players don't know the best design solutions, they are experts in their experience. I want to move past accessibility features versus features. We're still in our infancy, and there's a certain amount of misconception that we just need these settings, and hey presto, accessibility. We need to be cautious of thinking that accessibility is extra or different to all other design and features. It's rooted in the stigma of how society considers disabled people. I believe that we can avoid making those same mistakes. We need to be careful not to approach accessibility from a place that's divorced from the disability rights movement. When we do, we end up with things that only further stigmatize than create progress, such as euphemisms for disability. Accessibility menus show a wonderful commitment, but they're not the best UX solution. Organize settings by which aspect of the game they affect, not by who you expect to use them. This is what players generally look for because it's how we've always done it historically. More research at Ubisoft is showing that users will miss settings under this umbrella. Not everyone thinks accessibility is for them. To be truly accessible, we need to consider discoverability, approachability, and acceptance. In segregating accessibility, we may contribute to stigma that disabled players are different, which leads to very real toxicity and bullying in the community. Definitely talk up your commitment, approach, or settings in dev blogs and promo. Disabled players need this information before buying, and it helps build brand loyalty. This goes a long way for destigmatization and showing the community that it's acceptable. Pixelnix did this with Eagle Island, as did Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and they both went over so well. It's never possible to do everything in game dev, so don't let the fear of perfection stop you from doing anything. By doing something, you're allowing more people to experience your game, and that's too wonderful. We may make mistakes, it's how we learn. Celeste got an update with less alienating language. That's how we do it. Happy accidents absolutely count if we realize, correct our biases, and continue going forwards. Games that provide user control for rules and playstyles, flexible controls, robust onboarding like Risk of Rain 2 or Don't Starve are great. Accessibility is good usability. Still, it's always better in the end if we're deliberate in our approach. It's quality of life, not always zero access. Disabled players are more likely to push through and find a way. It often means playing is painful, exhausting, extra frustrating, or not fun. If one person tells you they can't play, there's even more who are just affected negatively. Inclusion is when everyone can talk up about how exciting or downright damn beautiful a game is. We can laugh at our failures and cheer at our hard-earned wins together. I deeply adore this industry. I want games to be the best they can be for everyone, regardless of gender, race, identity, or whether they're disabled. It's dangerous to go alone. Nothing about us without us is integral to getting it right. Accessibility really is enormous, and I've barely scratched the surface. Googling isn't a solution, because biased searches get us biased results. It's how we end up with colorblind simulators or dyslexia-friendly fonts instead of designing for usability. The Game Accessibility Guidelines is a robust living document made with feedback from the entire community. It can be overwhelming, so consultation with specialists help, which is likely more within your budget than you think. Watch talks from the Games Accessibility Conference and look up Game Maker's Toolkit series on YouTube. Little known fact, all GDC advocacy track talks are free, even when design-focused. Able Gamers has a card deck that guides you into early approaches. They also have over 400 players ready for testing. Leverage your community. Take feedback, prioritize it, if not for this project, then in the future. The internet is hostile, and having been targeted, I really have sympathy. We also can't let toxic elements silence marginalized players. Provide disabled players and outlets like Can I Play That, which was actually in the talk before I decided to give this out on Can I Play That, so it sounds like a funny PR thing, but there it is. Give them review copies is what I'm trying to say. With Glitch and one-person development Hyperdot, we created a user research campaign with disabled content creators. I'll be co-delivering a presentation on this at the UXR Summit next year if we're able to convene by then. But here's a summary. When I met with the team at E3, Hyperdot was already massively accessible due to the flexible nature of the design. They low-key became the adaptive controller station in the Microsoft Theater. I played the demo with a footboard with my arms while coming down with the flu and overworked from 3 back-to-back jobs. And in the really loud Microsoft Theater at E3, I still fell in love, so I knew they had something special. I immediately picked out some fantastic features of the core design. When they told me they had some ideas for research with disabled players, I could barely contain myself. Due to some of my work looking at approaches and user testing, I'd also had an idea of working with content creators, which was the exact line of thinking that Glitch was taking too. They asked players to stream or record gameplay and answered a short questionnaire about barriers. We approached recruitment with fundamental research ethics, such as not asking for disclosure of medical information, and Glitch are already a team of amazing researchers, so have data collection covered. Due to my connections in the community and friends in content creation, we started off with a robust list across the spectrum of disability, bolstering it with public recruitment. This improved the number of players who could commit and gave us even better cross-section of the community. Several players on my initial list are actually experienced subject matter experts, advocates, and consultants, so their feedback was particularly focused. The end results were really something. Not unusual for user testing, some players didn't know when they were hitting barriers, roadblocks, or missing information, so specialist observation alongside feedback enabled us to build a concise and productive list of around 35 key design points in the UI, gameplay, and onboarding. Holly at Glitch expertly ran the streams while we observed. Reports were there it goes again. Skipping to the end. Reports were compiled by myself as a specialist and Nicholas at Glitch as an experienced user researcher, making sure we weren't influenced by each other. Our findings overlapped nicely with nuanced differences based on our specialities. This solidified the findings and provided a framework for areas Charles, the solo developer, could look into to improve in the months leading up to release. I also provided some impact, priority, and design guidance. You can find some of the findings on the website in the slide at hyper.game.com/A11Y/. In short, I was pleasantly surprised. The game was even more accessible than we thought. Player experiences also provided great insight into the areas we already knew might be a choke point. In the future, there are definitely ways we could improve the approach, such as focusing the testing. Still, leaving it largely open meant we didn't influence player reactions very much. This kind of practice only gets us brilliant and actionable results, similar to This kind of practice not only gets us brilliant and actionable results, similar to user testing at larger scales like AAA, it uplifts a marginalized community that often doesn't have the numbers to be considered influencers into a public pre-release campaign. It's a fun way to build loyal community and can even be rolled into early access productions. Please pay for your players' time and expertise as you would with any user test, even if it's just Visa gift cards, merch, or similar, depending on your budget. Their feedback is invaluable. So much has been accomplished. I'm so proud of everyone. Let's keep building. Work as if you live in the early days of a better world. Thank you so much for listening. My weird fumbles. I know remotely delivered talks are a bit weird and harder to stay engaged with, and jokes just don't land without laughter. But I hope that you are well and safe. Thank you.